Hello, my American Studies 140 students. This is Professor Collins. This is the week one recording for DC Life Inside a Monument. And this week is basically about two issues. One is what is culture and how does this idea of what culture is relate to DC and the origins of DC as an idea and as the eventual city that it would become. Well, normally when folks teach this course, they get all theoretical about what culture is and give you the definition of culture from the standpoint of what anthropologists or sociologists or what other folks say around culture. But culture ultimately is everything we are. Everything that we think we are, every idea that we have, right? Culture is embedded in everything from what we eat, where we sleep, our concepts of what home and a house is, family, and the values that we hold in terms of family, what we believe in terms of a higher power or a god or gods or no gods at all, or what we don't believe, right? In terms of science or math, in terms of fact versus fiction, in terms of perception versus reality. Culture is embedded in everything that we do. The kinds of work that we do, the kinds of work that we don't like doing but still need to do, the chores that we have to do. It's everything, right? It's who we are. And culture and politics come together in that sense. There's nothing that is acultural or apolitical in a real sense. Even the most basic thing you can think of, like water. How do we get our water, right? Some cultures have wells, right? Most of human history involves people using well water to live, particularly in urban environments, but also plenty of times in rural environments too, because not everyone's near a river, not everyone has a freshwater lake nearby, or a sea that might be a freshwater sea, right? Or they're not living near blocks of ice that they can melt. So there's that. So it can be even as simple as bacon and eggs, right? Bacon and eggs is considered something universal when it's really not. Bacon and eggs is very Anglo-American. It's not even fully European, it's just an Anglo-American concept that you eat bacon and eggs because those happen to be the favorites of Englishmen and Welshmen and some extent Irishmen to a lesser extent and Scotsmen. And it becomes sort of an American staple. And even within that, there are ways of curing bacon or drying bacon or smoking bacon. There's also ways of cooking eggs. There's poached eggs versus scrambled eggs versus eggs over easy versus eggs over hard. There's what you season eggs with. Black pepper, which used to be more valuable than gold during ancient Roman and Greek times, which originally comes from South Asia, India, Sri Lanka, that part of the world, and makes its way across the world over time. That's a cultural statement. That's a political statement. So everything that you think is just sort of normal, everyday sorts of things really is cultural and political in nature. And so when you think about culture, don't just think about it as these big ideas like whether you're an existential philosopher or an atheist versus whether you are Christian or Muslim or Hindu or Jewish, right? It's really, really basic stuff. You know, the kind of clothes you wear. I'm wearing a form of raspberry shirt right now. That says something about me culturally versus someone who wears standard white and blue shirts. Okay? It says something about me culturally and says something about me politically. I don't know what quite yet, but it does say something. So when you think about that in terms of Washington, D.C., you have to think about D.C. as more than just this superpower imperialistic city that is the leader of the free world. DC has been that. For some people, it still is that. But you can't, but something that is doesn't mean it's always been. Things change over time. That's only one aspect of DC. That strip of land that from the West Potomac area of what's called technically West Potomac Park, the Lincoln Memorial, all the way out to the U.S. Capitol with Washington Monument and Smithsonian Museums and the African American Museum of History and Culture and all of that in between. That's one part of DC, and that's only one DC. There's so many other Washingtons besides that Washington. There's white Washington, there's affluent white Washington, there's gay and white Washington, there's LGBT Washington, there's black Washington, there's black elite Washington, there's Washington that is impoverished. There's the Washington that's black Washington that's east of the Anacostia River. There's that Washington too. There's historic Washington. There's contemporary gentrifying Washington. There are many more Washingtons besides just this grand monument to the world, this city upon a hill, literally kind of thinking that a lot of you might have about Washington, D.C. Now, normally in this course, this is where I ask you to draw a map of DC, what you think DC looks like on the map, and whether you can get an accurate picture of what Washington, DC does look like. But since this is the online version of this course, you can't do that exercise, and even if you could, you'd probably cheat and draw an accurate map, which is not the point of the exercise after all, so don't do that. But what that exercise points out is an example of how everyone perceives Washington, D.C. differently. When we've done this in the past, I have seen students draw a map of D.C. that's equivalent to, this is what the red line looks like going through D.C., right? There's people who draw accurate pictures of Washington. There are people who draw pictures of Washington the way it was originally conceived back in the 18th and early 19th century. There are folks who have no clue how to draw Washington. There are folks who draw Washington as the official sort of monument Washington. So let me say this before at the outset. This course is not about monuments. This course is about the history and culture of Washington, D.C. from 1790 to the present, which in this case is the year 2020 or 2021. So over the last 230 years, its origins, its changes, its evolution over time, the issues that it might have had, the cultures that it had and has, and so on and so forth. That's this course. So if you're expecting a course that's sort of a whitewashed version, and I mean that in multiple layers, in terms of in multiple meanings, in terms of whitewash, then this course is much more than that. So just fair warning. And so when you think about the origins of Washington, D.C., you have to start with the origins of the country itself. Country coming out of the American Revolution, out of the Articles of Confederation period, out of the Constitutional Convention of 1787, and creating its first constitution, electing basically a bunch of rich white males over the age of 21, elected George Washington's first president of the United States. Now, even most white males in this country couldn't vote in 1788 because they had to own land, they had to own property, and it couldn't just be an acre. They had to own, in some states, you had to own acres of property to vote for Washington. So Washington comes to power. And at that point, when Washington becomes president in 1789, New York City is the capital. And New York City is not a great place to be the nation's capital. It wasn't in 1789, certainly wouldn't be in 2020, and it hasn't been in between. And over the course of the previous 15 or so years, there have been capitals everywhere. York, Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, New York, Trenton, New Jersey, Camden, New Jersey, other part, I think Lehigh, Pennsylvania at one point was, Annapolis, Maryland. So they wanted to find a capital that would be uniquely, a unique federal seat. And there was a fight, as many fights in the early part of the nation's history tended to be, about location between northern states and southern states. The southern states, Virginia, Maryland, the Carolinas, Georgia, all wanted the capital to be south of what we now call the Mason-Dixon line, which is the border between Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Delaware, right? And states north of that Mason-Dixon line wanted a capital to be somewhere in Pennsylvania or ideally somewhere in New York. But the country also had a ton of debt. And Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury, wanted to consolidate all that debt and federalize it so that we could move forward as a nation. So they struck a compromise in 1790 called the Residence Act of 1790, as a matter of fact. That act officially declares that the seat of power for the federal government will be somewhere in the states of Maryland and Virginia, most of it in Maryland, right? No particular idea of where it would be, but it would be south of the Mason-Dixon line is the main point. It would be not in a place, not in a major city, but it would be its own planned built city. And that compromise, in exchange for that, all the states, particularly the northern states, could give their debt to the federal government, and it would federalize their debt so the states would not owe as separate states. France, people who supplied private funds and the rest across the country, or or what's now the UK, Great Britain, that kind of thing. And so that compromise was struck. That's how the nation's capital ended up being south of the Mason-Dixon line. But it also provided that George Washington himself would select the place where the capital would be. That's also part of the Residence Act of 1790. And so George Washington's first job is to figure out where to put the capital. Really, his first major job, his first major act as president, in addition to creating his cabinet, is to figure out where we're going to put the capital. So him and his surveyors go across the Maryland countryside. And that's what the D.C. area is at this point. It's farmland, it's countryside, it's a series of small towns, it's plantations where slaves are working, it's a small urban environment where there might be a town where slaves are working. And so the area that he picks is this area that we now call the district. And the Constitution establishes that the district should be 10 miles by 10 miles, meaning it would be 100 square miles in length. Well, George Washington himself decided that it would be in the shape of a diamond, so that it would be an inverted square, so that it would run along northeast, southeast, northwest, and southwest lines, 10 miles by 10 miles. So 10 times 10, length times width, is 100 square miles. And that it would cover the area that we now would call parts of, cover an area that's partly D.C., part of Virginia too, which would include parts of the city of Alexandria, Arlington County, and a little bit of tiny sliver of Fairfax County as well. That's how they were going to establish the capital. This is going to be the place. This place, by the way, includes what is now the small town of Georgetown, which was established in 1751. Washington County, Maryland, which of course is now to the northwestern part of Maryland, but it was Washington County back then. It would include what they would later call in 1802 Washington City, which was going to be different than Washington County, right? And it would include Arlington County. It would include the city of Alexandria and that little sliver of Fairfax County. Obviously, that's not D.C. now. But what it does point to is that D.C. is a southern city. Make no mistake about that. If you come away with one thing out of this course, is not to think about D.C. as being like New York, or New York, or Philadelphia, or Boston, or even Baltimore. It's its own little thing, and its own little thing includes more than a smidgen of southernness to it, because it is in fact planned in the middle of two states, Maryland and Virginia. And that's it for week 1.